Hello, I am Gentle Lee ASMR, and today I thought I would begin a new weekly series where I give an educational presentation. I personally really enjoy ASMR, where I can learn things at the same time. And so, this video will be on the thing that I am most professionally qualified to talk about, which is the different types of animation. I will be detailing the various kinds that one can make in a calm and relaxing tone. So, let us begin on our first lesson. Before we get started on the different types, there are a few keywords that I would like to go over because there are some animation concepts that overlap between the various mediums. Frame rate refers to the speed at which the images are displayed across the screen, and they are usually denoted in frames per second. The standard FPS values in animation are 12 and 24, although in more recent years, with the advent of 3D animation, that frame rate can go all the way up to 60 or more. The next important word is keyframe. Keyframe refers to an important point in the animation in which other frames are referenced from. So, the most extreme point in a gesture, or the most solid pose in a particular movement, all of the most important points of motion are represented in the keyframes. These next few words pertain to the structure of a typical animated film in the chronology of which it's made. The first is the animatic. The animatic is the first time-based representation of a particular animation, and that is the still images of the storyboard pieced together to play in order and time that it would in the movie. The purpose of an animatic is to serve as a reference point for all the other animation that is to be layered on top of it. After that point, you have the sketch layer, which is the rough animation that is often just represented in shapes and swoopy, sketchy lines that are often erased in the final product. The next step is line art, which is an uncolored, unshaded, polished drawing. And so that's like if you imagine any cartoon and take all the color out, you'd be left with the line art. Okay, now that I have covered some basic jargon that is frequently used in the various forms of animation, let me get started on detailing them. The first type of animation that I will be discussing is 2D traditional animation. This is most often associated in the West with the early days of Disney animation. In basic terms, 2D traditional animation are a series of drawings on thin, clear celluloid, which are then layered, photographed, and sequenced into a moving image. This is a very laborious and time-intensive process that also involves a lot of resources. So this version of animation has largely gone out of style, but is still sometimes utilized by dedicated artists. In order to create a 2D traditional animation, you must first start with the pencil layer. The pencil layer begins with the keyframes, those most important points in animation, who are most responsible for the overall look of the film. After that, the pencil sketch then transfers to the in-betweeners, who are kind of lower on the rung typically, and fill in the space between the keyframes. And those frames in between are often called tweens. That phrase will come up later as it is appropriated in digital animation as well. After the pencil layer is finished comes the celluloid, which are very thin, layerable sheets of plastic. The first thing that is done with the celluloid is that the pencil layer is traced in ink, and then after it is inked, it is given over to colorists who flip it over onto the other side and build on the color. And in order to color onto celluloid, you have to kind of think about it in reverse, because the first colors that you put on will be the most prominent on the cell. So it kind of requires an ability to reverse engineer your painting. After the cells are painted, you have nearly a complete animation. So then it goes to the camera. This animation camera is able to place all of the images in exactly the same orientation. So when the images are sequenced afterwards, they do not appear to shake. After the pictures are taken, the final step is to sequence all of them and put them onto a roll of film. And after you have that roll of film, you have your completed animation. While traditional animation is something that's deeply appreciated by animation nerds like me, it is understandable why it has fallen out of favor, because it is extremely time, labor, and resource intensive. So much so that the last fully traditional Disney animated movie was in 1988 with Oliver and Company. So, what replaced traditional 2D animation? Well, that would be 2D digital animation, which I personally am much more directly familiar with. Digital has largely replaced traditional 2D animation because it is pretty much just in execution simpler in every way, because it requires less people, less time, less money, less resources. Although the trade-off with that is that it is a lot easier to have kind of a lousy, lazy-looking final product in a digital animation. One could argue that even rough traditional animations have kind of a nice hand-touched charm to them, and lousy digital animations don't tend to be that way. There are two kinds of 2D digital animation. The first kind of mimics the process used by traditional filmmakers, which is it starts with the sketch layer and then has an inked layer and then a color layer, but instead of using celluloid, these things are accomplished with digital layers. These use raster images usually instead of vector, and this style is more time intensive than the second version. The style most associated with flash animations uses something called tweening, which is something slightly different than used in the traditional context. Tweening is instead an algorithm that fills in the information between two different keyframes with a command of what you would like it to do. And while this can save a lot of time, it also lends sort of a robotic and soulless look to the animation that can be avoided by drawing out most of the frames. Another major benefit of digital animation is its ability for live playback. You can see your film as it progresses in real time instead of having to wait until the very end when your cells are captured on that big camera rig. So it has a bit more of a instant gratification element, I suppose. Instead of manually sequencing the images like you would in a traditional animation, the exporting and sequencing is done in software and then exported to digital video for the finished product. In feature films in particular, there's one style that has replaced both of these 2D styles easily, which is 3D animation. 3D is a bit different as it's the structural process of it looks a lot different from how a 2D animator would go about making their works. A big part of this is how incredibly collaborative 3D art and 3D filmmaking is. Especially nowadays, things are rarely made from scratch because there is such an enormous bank of resources created by other people already to accomplish the things that you need done. And especially if you have access to proprietary things like Disney and Pixar does, that sort of large teamwork cooperative setup renders 3D animation the easiest option for large industrial scale filmmaking. So the steps to create a 3D animation are a little bit different, although it does often begin the same way with an animatic and pencil sketch, although occasionally the pencil sketch is omitted. An animatic is standard, however. So, the first thing that needs to be done to create a 3D animation is to build the assets. Each asset represents an object in the environment, so that could be a person, a thing, or a place. All of these have to be individually sculpted, although because of the collaborative aspect I mentioned earlier, you're often able to take from things that people have sculpted previously and work from that, or just entirely appropriate it. There's a lot of different ways to go about sculpting a 3D object, although it is also entirely possible to sculpt from scratch. After each 3D object is sculpted, then the objects need to be rigged, which means they are given the ability to move. Most animation softwares come with pre-existing rigs for commonly used anatomical structures like humans, cats, dogs, etc. These kind of look like a stick figure that you sort of place inside the body of your sculpted model to sort of move them like a puppet. And after you've sculpted and rigged your objects for your animation, then you are finally able to make your keyframes. The part where the motion is actually created shares a lot of similarity with certain parts of 2D digital filmmaking because the tweening algorithms are usually very similar, and also the interface is usually also very similar to a standard digital animation interface. The difference is, instead of drawing on the screen, you're taking the different points that you've made that allow yourself to control the figures and moving them around the environment. So after the motion is created and the set is placed, the next thing to do after that is usually lighting. Lighting is a very important part of 3D animation and can make something lousy look very impressive. So it's sort of the most movie magic moment, in my opinion, in 3D. So 3D animation lighting is actually very, very similar to real life studio lighting, and tends to work a lot of the same way. And you can use real life studio lighting rules and apply it to a digital 3D space, and it all works out essentially the same way. And the same goes for the filming itself. When you are capturing a 3D animation, you place cameras in the environment as if you were actually filming, like they're yourself. And that way the cameras can kind of be controlled like a real life camera, and you can change the depth of field and shutter speed to create an effect more like a film instead of something created by a computer. The final step to producing 3D animation is rendering. Rendering is an extremely time-intensive process, and it's also prone to a lot of failures. Rendering is largely a 3D artist's bane, unless you have access to one of those huge rendering farms like Pixar has, which most of us don't. The final form of animation that I will be discussing today is stop motion. Stop motion is an umbrella term that just about covers any other kind of still image filmmaking that is not drawn or 3D animated. Stop motion usually requires a camera with a sturdy base to avoid jitter from frame to frame. The technique of keyframes and in-betweens doesn't tend to work so well for stop motion. Generally, you need to shoot in a continuous linear format, especially if there is any natural light involved. So, let's discuss some different subtypes of stop motion. The first is claymation. In claymation, the figures are sculpted using plasticine clay or another non-hardening sculpture medium, and then posed minutely from frame to frame to create the illusion of movement. This is also a very time-consuming and resource-intensive style of animation, and I feel like a lot of modern claymations just kind of tend to exist as a visual marvel, and well, I don't mind it. I like to see animators flexing. So, the next kind of stop motion is cut paper. Cut paper stop motion is exactly what it sounds like, It uses cut pieces of paper to represent the figures and sets on the board. Generally, a cut paper animation is used with kind of a similar camera to a traditional animation capturing camera, one that places everything in exactly the same space every time. And then in order to create motion there, you reach in and slightly move the papers or replace them. A popular example of that is South Park before it switched to digital. Another kind of stop motion, which is my personal favorite because I love doing these, is whiteboard animations. For a whiteboard animation, the camera is held in a single sturdy place, and so is the whiteboard, and you draw each frame onto the board, take a picture, erase, and then draw the next frame. It is a slow and tedious process, but has very interesting final results. The same process can be used with any other erasable medium. Next is pixelation. Pixelation, spelled with 2 I's and not an E, is when humans are used in stop motion, so still frames to create a natural appearance of movement. You actually see a lot of these on TikTok nowadays. Any other kind of animation that involves still images that doesn't fall under one of those categories is generally just called stop motion. And that is my lesson on the various types of animation. I really hope that you've enjoyed this lesson and that you've gained some useful information. And with that, I sincerely hope that you have a very, very good